I'm Will from Unharm. I always start by, I guess, talking about why I'm involved in drug law reform, and I'll start with that to explain where I'm coming from. So yeah, I mean, I had a privileged kind of upbringing. I went to school the expensive way. I went to school in Sydney on Sydney's North Shore. It was 1995. I was in year 10 on the way to school. Very studious person. Not really into the rave scene, though it was a big deal in those days. The Sydney rave scene kind of died out in '97 under police pressure, bad drugs and dodgy promoters. But it was certainly a background to those years, and I distinctly remember that one day on the bus on the way to school, a friend of mine handed me the headphones for his Discman, I think. It was playing a happy hardcore mixtape, which at 15 sounded fantastic to me, a DJ called DJ Scooter. And by the time the bell rang for class, I was still staring into space, listening to the music, thinking, my God, there's another world. So when I left school, the club scene was a big part of my life. First as a dancer and then as a DJ and promoter, and illicit drug use was very much a part of that experience. And I had some of the best times of my life in clubs using drugs like MDMA and cannabis. And at the same time, I was very aware during that period that I had a friend in particular who had an anxiety condition and a benzodiazepine addiction and a habit of wigging out on pills. And so the risks, like I think is the case for a lot of people, were always clear to me, but at the same time, some of those experiences were really fantastic experiences. And as I came to the end of that period of my life, I began to think more and more, what happens to these experiences? What do we do with these things, these prohibited experiences that are so meaningful, and yet at the same time can't even be discussed? They're got to be completely disavowed. How do you integrate that with the rest of your life? Well, that kind of became dormant for me for a while until I moved to King's Cross. I live in King's Cross in Sydney. And one of the things that I was really struck by living in the Cross is that when you walk around the streets of the Cross, that thing that you hear about so much when people talk about drugs, the street, is a phenomenon of poor and marginalised people's drug use. I don't buy, sell, or use drugs on the street. And so the people who I see being searched by the cops, being arrested, being put in paddy wagons day after day are overwhelmingly people who are homeless, people who are experiencing mental illness, people who have dependencies and might be engaged in sex work to pay for drugs, and people who are Aboriginal. Meanwhile, streaming past the paddy wagons are hundreds upon hundreds of professionals walking to the train station to catch the train to work. And I've seen the statistics, it would be inevitable that a majority of those people had also been illicit drug users in their life, and yet the police don't even look at them. And it really struck me that one of the worst things about the criminalisation of drug use is that it is a way for society to fuck over the people who've already been fucked over. It's another layer on people who are already at the margins, and that really struck me. And then the final thing, that perhaps even that wouldn't have been enough if it hadn't been for the fact that I have kids. And like I said, I live in the Cross. I actually live right by King's Cross Police Station, and so very often, we see the police around. There are a lot of police in the Cross, less than there used to be, but there's definitely a lot. And my kids, they're 4 and 6. They're both boys. They love the emergency services and all that. They love the firefighters and the uniforms, and they love police officers. And so when we see police officers, they're interested. They want to interact. And the police are always really lovely to my kids. And looking at that, it made me uncomfortable. And I had to really think about why it makes me uncomfortable to see the cops interacting with my kids. And I realized in thinking that through that I have taken on this distrust of the police that comes from a simple sense of self-protection, from being a person who, like most people in my generation, has used illicit drugs. And then I thought, well, what do I tell my kids, I've seen the data, right? It's almost inevitable, even if I won't encourage them to use illicit drugs, it's more likely than not that they will. So in order to prevent them from one of the most likely bad things that could happen as a result of their illicit drug use, i.e. being arrested, essentially I have to teach them to distrust the police. And that was something that I was really uncomfortable about as someone who believes in civil society and sees that, a good police force is an important part of that. To have to teach my kids to distrust the police is not something that sat well with me. At the same time, I was working as a policy consultant. So I worked in an organisation that consulted to government, and we did social research and program evaluation, and a lot of that was in drug and alcohol policy. So often I was evaluating programs that government was running, to encourage people, for example, to stop smoking when they're pregnant, or to drink less, or things like to drive more safely on the roads. A lot of it was about illicit drug policy as well. And one of the things that I observed in that situation was that there's this real piety. People always like to talk about collaboration between health and police, as if that is going to solve all the problems that we've got with drug use. If only police and health could work more closely together, everything would be fine. What made me uncomfortable is, of course, that the elephant in the room was never mentioned, that the laws that police were enforcing were themselves harm-creating. That couldn't even be discussed or mentioned. And at the same time, there we were evaluating all these programs that were on the harm reduction side of the National Drug Strategy, at the same time that the bulk of the spending, more than $1 billion a year, was going on policing and enforcement. And there's absolutely no economic evaluation of what we get in return for that kind of spending. The reality is, of course, that we get very little, and in fact that has even been acknowledged, for example, in the new ICE Task Force report, which said that we can't arrest our way out of this, and supply control is essentially unable to control the availability of methamphetamine in Australia. So basically, we know that we get no return on that $1 billion, and yet that doesn't actually have any effect in that policy environment. It was an environment that I thought was completely alienated from honesty about the reality of what was going on. And so I began to think more about this, and I talked with a friend of mine, an author, Lisa Pryor, who's wrote a book called A Small Book About Drugs. And in particular, she identified this situation where illegal drug use is actually statistically a normal behaviour. So I'm 37. Among Australian adults under 40, illicit drug use at some point in your lifetime is statistically normal. Most people have used an illicit drug in that age group. At the same time, the majority of that use is unproblematic. Most people don't develop any problems in relation to their illicit or illicit drug use. And I think what Lisa was so acute in observing was that there's this huge silence around that, huge silence around the fact that even very many of those people who use illicit drugs are successful, competent people. And the fact that there is that silence has such a limiting effect on the possibility of political change. People don't tend to get involved because there's a sense of being able to hide in private life, keep your drug use discreet and deal with it at an individual level. But to me, that wasn't something that I could live with, especially not looking at my kids and thinking, what am I going to pass on to you? And so it was because of that that I began to think about that silencing effect and what we could do about it and how to help make political change in that context. Because of that, I started talking to a lot of people about drugs and about drug use and drug policy. And from that process came the idea for an organisation which has become Unharm. Unharm is a grassroots organisation that's campaigning for a world where drug use is as safe, positive and ethical as it can be. You hear a lot about war on drugs, and I think it's become widely recognised that war on drugs is a war on people. Unharm is for us. It's an organisation to build a people's movement for drug policy that puts people first. Essentially, it's a way to teach us to become activists and leaders in a movement where we use digital communication and community organising to put pressure on politicians to support policy that aligns with our vision. And what that vision means, safer drug use means safer drug practices, using drugs in safer ways. And it also means drugs that come in standardized dosages with honest labeling and no contaminants. Drug use that is more positive means, decriminalizing and destigmatizing drug use and addressing some of the drivers of problematic drug use. And drug use that is as ethical as it can be means taking the profit from organised crime and using it to fund things like schools and healthcare, and also encouraging personal responsibility among people who use drugs. So you've probably heard in justice movements the idea that the arc of history bends towards justice, and we can see that it's beginning to bend. But at the same time, we can also see it's got a lot of bending to do. At the same time, though, I think we're actually further ahead in one respect than we might sometimes realise. Now, I happen to believe that drug use should not be a crime, right? If you're an Australian in 2016 who believes that drug use should not be a crime, you are in the majority. The reference to that is the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. I'm happy to talk to you about the data, but go with me at this point. It is a normal thing to believe that drug use should not be a crime. It's also something that is backed up by a whole host of organisations and, in fact, even our own National Drug Strategy, where criminalising drug consumers is not mentioned at all. It's supported by organisations like the World Health Organization, Human Rights Watch, many UN organisations with the exception of the one with responsibility for drugs, and many, and a growing list of organisations and, in fact, countries. But at the same time, here in Australia, arrests have been rising steadily for the last 10 years. There's now more than 90,000 people in Australia who are arrested each year for drug consumer offences alone. And the majority of those people are arrested for cannabis consumer offences. It's about 2/3 of all drug consumer arrests are for cannabis. More than 1,000 people every week. Very, very few Australians agree that those arrests make sense. And they're right. Criminalising drug use stigmatises drug users. It makes it harder to live well. It promotes risk. It reduces opportunities to work in particular kinds of jobs. It reduces your educational opportunities. It interferes with people's family and relationships. It wastes billions of dollars enforcing policies that don't work at the same time that there's this huge economic cost from reducing the opportunities of people who could otherwise contribute in fuller ways to the economy. And it makes it much more difficult to introduce programs that promote safety among people who use drugs. A great example of that is supervised injecting facilities. Now that's a strategy to promote safety among people who use drugs, and it's something that is supported by a majority of Australians. 52% of Australians support supervised injecting facilities, but the criminalisation of drug use is a huge obstacle to actually introducing more of those services. Another great example is pill testing. It's something that is supported by an overwhelming majority of the people in the target market, which is young people. That's where the primary consumption of drugs like MDMA happens. About 80% of young people support pill testing. You'd never know it from the political rhetoric, and it's something that, again, the criminalisation of drug use makes very difficult to introduce. Sometimes that can seem a little bit abstract. So here's an example of how the criminalisation of drug use lands in the life of one particular person. There's a woman who lives in my community. She is experiencing mental health issues. She's homeless. She's engaged in sex work to fund a methamphetamine, to fund her drug use. She's been arrested 38 times. And this is someone whom every service in the community is attempting to help. But every time she engages with one of these services that can help her with substance use, housing, etc., she disappears again because she's back in jail. Now, on the one hand, we have police who are claiming to be promoting harm minimization, but on the other hand, those 90,000 arrests have real effects in people's lives that are hugely detrimental to some of the most disadvantaged people in our communities. And it's not something that we should continue to accept. To me, although globally we're seeing a shift away from criminalisation of drug use, and in fact even in Australia we have this thing called the National Diversion Framework, which sets up a framework to essentially divert people who are caught in possession of personal quantities of drugs, to divert them out of the criminal justice system and into health programs. This is something that was funded to a huge level by John Howard, of all people. Even while we have that trajectory, that happened about 10 years ago, we're still arresting more people than ever. And to me, it's like zombie policy, right? It's dead, but it's not buried yet, and it's still running around creating more corpses. So, what I'm asking is that you advocate for the idea that drug use should not be a crime, even if your main game is legal access to cannabis. And so what I'd ask is that the next time you hear someone in the cannabis law reform movement advocate for the idea that other people should be criminalised for their drug use, take the time to talk with them about the idea that drug use should not be a crime. Other things that you can do are buy the t-shirt. We're selling them this weekend. They're $20 each. We'll have a little stall set up. All the money will be used to support Unharm's campaigning in this area. You can also sign up to our mailing list. We'd love to get you on board. Unharm is about bringing people together to build power, to put pressure on politicians. The more people who join our organisation, the more powerful that we become and the more capacity we have to make change. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions.
Any questions from anyone?
I'm happy not to as well.
I was going to say, where are you going to sell your shirts?
That's something I was going to ask you about,
okay.
Kath.
Well, how about out there in the Hall garden?
Okay,
yeah.
that sounds good.
Okay, thank you very much, Will. That's awesome.